Welcome to the Enneagram and Movie Videos. I'm TJ Daw here with Mario Sikora, and we're here to talk about the final girl trope in horror movies. How you doing, Mario?
I'm doing great. I'm looking forward to talking about something I don't know anything about. So why don't you explain why we're talking about this and what you mean by the final girl trope?
Happy to. Yeah, I too am not a horror movie buff, but many people are. And something that I have noticed in the last handful of years is that many of the people, at least on my social media feed, who are really into horror movies are women. And
Uh,
that fits in with the trope of the final girl. So this was a trope that was coined. The term was coined by a woman named Carol J. Clover in her book Men, Women, and Chainsaws: Gender in the Modern Horror Film. And here's what the trope means. In a horror movie, there's usually a killer of some kind, might be supernatural, might not be supernatural, who goes after a handful of victims, picks them off one at a time, and usually the final survivor is female. And maybe she dies at the very end. Usually she survives and then reappears in the sequel. Maybe she gets killed in the sequel, or maybe she survives that too, comes back again and again. And sometimes she'll turn it around and come back for the killer and get him. This is a trope. And some famous examples of this: Jamie Lee Curtis's character in Halloween, definitely one of the most famous ones. And she came back in part two, and then she came back in a sequel, H2O, 20 years later. There's also Ripley in Alien and Sigourney Weaver's character.
yeah,
You see this again in Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Most of the Nightmare on Elm Street movies, every installment of Friday the 13th. Scream is a movie which is kind of a postmodern horror movie from the 90s, where it's very deliberate about its use of horror movie tropes. So that has two final girls. Neve Campbell is one of them, and Courtney Cox is the other, and both of them show up in succeeding sequels.
mm,
Uh, you see this again in Resident Evil, in Suspiria, and then in some movies that aren't technically horror movies, like The Terminator or Gravity or The Menu or Barbarian. So this is a
right,
well-known trope. And in some
right,
movies, they'll turn it upside down. They'll make it a final boy. Some movies, they'll have the final girl get killed right at the end, like I said. But this is a
right.
very common trope in horror
Yeah.
movies.
So tie this to the Enneagram for us, because this is an Enneagram podcast or
Yeah.
video series what we're doing. So tie it to the Enneagram.
Yeah. A big theory that I have about horror movies in general is that horror movies address preserving needs. So the preserving instinctual bias at its very basic level is about survival. It's about physical survival. It's about staying alive. And horror movies are about trying to stay alive when someone or something is actively trying to kill you. So this addresses the kind of the deep down anxiety that people who favor the preserving instinctual bias have in general, because it's not a flattering description of the preserving bias, but there's usually a sense of underlying anxiety.
Mhm.
There isn't going to be enough of what I need. So if I'm fixated on resources, like how much money I have in the bank or how much food I have in the cupboard, there's this kind of low level constant fear of, like, what if there's a financial crash? Or what if I lose my job? Or if where my preserving instinctual biases focuses on is health, like what if I go through a health crisis? That kind of thing, as
Yeah.
well as this sense of danger, of just like this sense that the world is a dangerous place. You could get in a car accident. You could find yourself in the crosshairs of a maniac who wants to kill you.
Yeah. And as you're saying this, and again, I'm not a horror movie fan. We've discussed this, and some of them are fine. I really enjoyed Scream, for example, the original one. Certainly, Aliens is a great movie, although I tend to think of that more as action sci-fi than horror. But clearly, it's also horror. And I see where you're going with them being associated with the preserving bias. Okay. And the thing I'll add to what you said about the preserving bias is the reason I don't call it self preservation, I call it preserving, is because this need to preserve extends beyond the self. Okay. It is not just preserving me, but it's also preserving the people that I care about, particularly the offspring. And from the movies that I'm familiar with, that also tends to come up. It's often not just the last woman trying to save herself, although that is part of it, but there's also this very often this theme of trying to save others as well. right? Ripley, for example, with Newt in Aliens, is a great example of that. But
Or with the
how does
cat in the first Alien movie,
right,
Jones,
right,
like,
right. So
save that cat.
yeah. So tell me, how does that fit in for you? I mean, is that consistent with some of these other movies as far as you're aware?
Horror movies generally are about groups of friends.
Yeah,
Like, again, many, many examples of that, but it's usually a group of friends, usually attractive young people.
yeah,
So it's like, but how are we all going to survive?
right,
So again, it's like, yeah, it's not like in these movies, somebody's like, well, I don't care if the maniac kills you. All I
right,
care about is if they leave me alone. Like,
right,
that's not something you ever hear in a horror movie. It's
right,
like, we're all going to die. How do we stay away? How do we stay
right,
alive? What do we do?
right,
How do we
right.
band together? How do we protect ourselves? How do we fight this maniac?
Yeah. It's interesting because, as you say that, again, I'm sure that not all the characters in these movies, in my experience, are preservers themselves, right? So it could be you've got a navigator in a preserving situation, or a transmitter even in a preserving situation. And one of the things that, I say when I teach this stuff is that circumstances will shape the way these instinctual biases express themselves. Okay. So you might be, in your case, you're transmitting, but during COVID, we all became preserving, right? If there's a guy with a chainsaw chasing us, we're going to become very preserving, right? I'm not going to try and understand this person, and figure out what the group politics here, and I'll do those other sort of navigating stuff. And you're not going to try to impress them with ideas you have and that sort of thing. You're going to run like hell, right? And try to get away from them. So it does sort of put this. It's an example of how circumstances will shape how the instinctual biases express themselves, and that we're not fixed, we're not robots, but when we need to preserve, we'll preserve, whether we're preservers or not.
And something I've heard you say is that our instinctual bias, one of the ways to determine it is, where does our mind go when it doesn't have to go anywhere else?
Yeah.
Which is not the circumstance when someone's chasing you with a chainsaw.
Right, right,
You just do not have the bandwidth
right.
to think about, like, what are the group politics, or
Yeah.
how am I going to make my legacy? It's more like, oh my God, how do I stay alive?
Right, right. And the thing to remember too is that I think that a lot of the literature about the instinctual bias, or the instincts, so to speak, is about 100 years out of date, right? It's this idea that we've got these three instincts and one of them dominates us and all this sort of stuff. That's not really how it works. And the way I think of this is that our psychobiological needs can be put into three clusters, right? Three categories. And we each have a tendency to prioritize one of those categories. Okay. Some people prioritize the preserving needs. Okay. And others, the navigating, others, the transmitting. And, to your point earlier, just because I prioritize those needs when, all things are equal, doesn't mean I'm going to prioritize them the same way based on circumstances, right? If I'm a teenager and I move to a new town and I start at a new school, I'm going to go the Mean Girls route, and try to fit in, try to figure it out. I'm going to, the main character in that movie. And if, it's a weekend in a college town, right? You can see a whole lot of transmitting going on, whether the people are transmitters or not, right? Because it's a bunch of horny kids and they're trying to get the attention of of the desired other. So yes, great example of how this forces us all to become preserving.
And I think preserving is thrust on women in general,
Mm.
whether they're preservers or not, in terms of, and I'm quoting a woman that I worked with recently. I worked on a psychologist with a stage show called The Psychology of Serial Killers. The opening line of the show is, men spend their lives scanning for sexual opportunities. Women spend their lives scanning for danger.
Mm.
And something that, as a man, I've never experienced, but I've heard a number of women describe, is that it's just kind of normal for women to go through the world with their keys in their fists. Or if they're meeting a guy for a date and they're going to his place, to have arranged with a girlfriend, like, if I haven't called or texted you by this point, call 911.
Yeah.
Or just to have their head on a swivel when they're in a parking lot, or
Yeah.
have their guard go up when they're in an elevator. So whether a woman's a preserver, a navigator, or a transmitter, there's just this sense of like danger is omnipresent and could strike at any time. And I would be a fool if I let my guard down.
Yeah. And first of all, I agree with all of that, and it also goes to another level. There's a cultural expectation of women to be the people who tend to the nest, right? Which is what the preserving domain is all about. So there is this, somebody's got to cook and clean and, wash the sheets and all these other sort of things. And even though we live in a time when many women work just as much as men do outside the home. They have jobs, demanding jobs. When everybody goes home at night, it's still more likely than not falls on the woman to take care of those things, right? I remember having a client who was a very senior executive at a company, and her career was really taking off, and they, decided that the husband would stay home and raise the kids, right? And it made financial sense, it made family stability sense, all that sort of thing. And she said to me one day, she said, "You know what? He's mom during the day, but as soon as I walk in the door, no matter how rough a day I've had, how tired I am, how late it is, I become mom then. And the kids turn to me, right? Dad can be sitting right there on the sofa, but they look to me to serve those needs for them, right? So you're right. I do think that this is, and one of the things I see when I work with people is that far more women misidentify themselves as preservers than men do. Okay. Because of those social expectations and because of that anxiety or that fear that you're talking about.
Yeah, it's more there's more of a stigma to a woman who can't cook than there is for a man who can't cook, for
Right.
instance,
Right.
or for a man to live like a slob. It's just that's a societally accepted
Right.
aspect of
Right.
like, well, of course he would.
Right.
Whereas for a woman, it's like she's failing at being a woman. So
Yes.
as much social progress as we've made, we've still got a lot of these things going on that just seep their way into our consciousness, whether we realize it or not.
Yeah.
And one of the ways I see this connecting to horror movies is that I think a lot of women are into horror movies because they live vicariously through the main character. And I think the parallel for men is action movies. And let me expand on that a little bit.
Yeah.
So, with action movies, the very premise when men are living vicariously through the main characters is just imagining if the shit hit the fan, what would I do? I would kick ass. I would go into action mode. I would fist fight. I would gunfight. I would car chase. I would maybe rescue a family member or a love interest like a Taken or in Commando. I would be heroic. I would be strategic, maybe like a Predator. I might have to take a severe beating, but then I would shake it off and triumph, like in Raiders of the Lost Ark or in Die Hard. And the parallel in horror movies is I can imagine women watching this and at some level thinking, if the shit hit the fan, what would I do? I would run for my fucking life. I would scream, I would hide, I would escape, I would desperately call for help, and maybe I would rally myself and set a trap for the killer and just barely survive and live on another day. So it's not as flattering of a fantasy, but at the same time, it can also, and I've heard a woman describe the value of horror movies in this way, provide like a masochistic thrill. And I can also see some elements of Enneagram type 6 in this, in terms of sixes also go through life with kind of a pervading anxiety of like, what if something goes wrong? And usually that anxiety is most active when everything's fine.
Yeah.
When things are calm, that's when the thought comes up of like, well, that means danger is just about to strike out of nowhere, and I better be ready for that. Whereas when danger is happening, they're surprisingly in the moment
Yeah.
and able to respond to exactly what's going on. So I think even watching a horror movie or listening to a true crime podcast works on that level too. Like, if there's nothing to be scared about, I'm scared. If there's something to be scared about, I'm not scared, weirdly enough.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And one of the things that came to mind as you were speaking is that very often in these movies, the initial hero looks like it's going to be one of the men, right?
Right.
There's always that kind of macho guy or, the one everybody turns to protect us who usually gets dispatched pretty quickly, right, is one of the first ones to go, almost sending a message of, you sent your best, and I dispatched of it. Or that's not really how it works in the real world, right?
Totally.
The macho kind of, I always think of as the sofa hero, right? Who's sitting there on the sofa. You see this in sports all the time, right? You got people watching sports who have never thrown a ball in their life. Oh, he should do this. Oh, he should do that, sort of thing, right? Oh, that, you know, professional elite athlete sucks because he made this mistake or that mistake, right?
Or the
And
coach sucks
yeah,
because
right.
he had to do this play instead of the play that they should have done, which I
Right,
know.
right, right. And whereas, the message of these things is, yeah, that's not really how it works, right? If there's a serial killer out there or some kind of psycho, he's better at this than you are, right? So playing his game of being tough and, scary and violent probably isn't going to work for you.
Another trope of horror movies is the derisive law enforcement officer.
Yeah,
So the screaming, terrorized victims try to get the sheriff to take them seriously, and he doesn't. He dismisses them, he downplays it, he laughs at them. This happens in I Know What You Did Last Summer,
mm,
where the sheriff is just like mocking the Sarah Michelle Gellar character.
mm,
And then, of course, what happens to him? He blunders right into the killer's clutches and then dies like that. And
right.
this is a cop. This is somebody who's armed, somebody whose whole job is to deal with danger. So that's part of it too, is like exactly as you said, the macho approach, not good in this situation,
Yeah,
as well as that kind of anxious belief that the people in authority aren't that great at what they're doing.
right,
The people whose job is to protect you, well, in some cases, they can't.
right.
And if they can't, then what can you do? Scream, run, and survive.
Yeah. I'll share another correlation that I see. So with the pattern of expression around the instinctual biases for preservers, the transmitting domain is what we call the zone of indifference, right? And so the preservers tend to have this kind of dismissive attitude toward things related to transmitting. Okay. It's almost as if, I just don't have the time and energy to put myself out there, to draw attention to myself. And often when I'm working with clients, I try to get the preservers to assert themselves more, right? To draw more attention to themselves professionally so people know what they're capable of. And they always resist it. And they almost always say, I don't want to be that person who's drawing attention to themselves, puffing their feathers, but doesn't have any real substance to them. And that seems to be in the movies, that's the person that gets dispatched first, right? That, the one, strutting their feathers, thinking they're, all this and, really finding out that they're kind of empty and not contributing much. So, yeah.
So yeah, that's the final girl.
All right, good.
And one contrasting example I'll just bring up quickly is the Evil Dead movies, in which it's the main character is a man, played by Bruce Campbell. And Bruce Campbell is funny and self-deprecating, and Evil Dead 2 is as much a comedy as it's a horror movie, if not more.
Right.
It's an absolutely wonderful movie, but Ash, the character that he plays, is presented as such an everyman. He's just a schnook who works at a Kmart, for instance. It's called S Mart. And when things go down, before long, he is the ripped muscle, torn shirt hero who is chopped off his own hand when it gets possessed, and then fashions a chainsaw onto his stump that he can activate with a pull cord, and then has a shotgun on a
Uh,
holster on his back so he can pull that out. And he becomes the action hero,
right.
basically. And then at the end
Gotcha.
of Evil Dead 2, he gets sucked into a time vortex and gets brought back to medieval times and then kicks ass there too.
Right.
And of course, it's very comedic and he doesn't take himself seriously. And yet there's still that element of like, I am kicking ass and
Right.
I am awesome.
Yeah.
You,
So,
I just can't think of a woman who's the equivalent of that, even Sigourney Weaver,
right,
who's a tough eight in the Alien movies.
right, right.
There's
And
no
probably in
kind
real
of
life
like,
too. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. And
Right.
there's no sense of like, I am the shit.
Right.
It's more like, I'm going to do what I need to do. And this is the last place I want to be. And if I get out of this alive with the people I care about, then that's all the victory I want.
Mm. So one more thing comes to mind, then we'll wrap up. But as you were talking about the correlation between type 6 and the preserving domain, or the similarities, I find that most movies that have a preserving theme either feel kind of six-ish, where they're dealing with fear and threat, or kind of one-ish, where they're dealing with, some need to put structure and order on the world, right? Excuse me, the movie Big Night, for example, comes to mind with Stanley Tucci and Tony Shalhoub and Ian Holm. Really wonderful movie. And it's about these two brothers having a restaurant. And the one brother is very strict about doing traditional food and that sort of thing. But the restaurant is struggling because he won't, serve spaghetti and meatballs, kind of thing. So it's both a preserving movie and also kind of a one-ish movie. So I think probably if we were to start looking at preserving movies in general, they might break broadly into those two camps. It'll be something worth exploring as we go.
Well, one more thing that's
Yeah.
coming up for me about horror movies is there's usually an element of guilt.
Mm,
There's some kind of sin, and that's what brings on the killer.
mm,
So in Friday the 13th, it's because teenage Jason Voorhees drowned in a summer camp while the counselors were making out. So his killings are all revenge killings.
mm,
In Nightmare on Elm Street, Fred Krueger was killed by a vigilante group of parents after he got off on a technicality after having been arrested for molesting children. In I Know What You Did Last Summer, it's a group of teenagers that hit a pedestrian on the street and then cover up the killing.
mm,
So there's often this sense of retribution
mm.
of like, you have sinned and gone unpunished, and you will be punished for this.
Very interesting. All right, good. Well, TJ, that was fun. I'm glad we did this episode. It's not one that I would have thought to do, but I'm glad you brought it up, and it was a good conversation.
Thank you. Yeah, this was great fun.